They called her just a grease monkey until enemy jets appeared. The first missile strike hit the runway at 0347 hours. The second took out the control tower. By the time the sirens stopped wailing, every operational aircraft at Nellis Air Force Base was either destroyed or damaged beyond flight capability, except one. An F-16 that Staff Sergeant Zoe Harper had been rebuilding from spare parts, a plane everyone said would never fly again. What the enemy didn't know was that the woman covered in engine oil wasn't just a mechanic. She was the pilot who could make that impossible aircraft dance. But this story isn't just about a night attack and a heroic flight. This is the story of a legend forced to hide her identity. The story of why one of the world's most lethal pilots was fixing engines in a hangar corner where no one recognized her. And the story of why that impossible F-16 wasn't an accident. It was part of her plan to return. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, from which city in the world are you watching today? And if stories like this move you, please consider subscribing. For 5 years, Zoe Harper had been invisible at Nellis Air Force Base. She arrived before dawn, left after sunset, and spent her days elbow-deep in aircraft engines. The other mechanics respected her skill, but never questioned why someone so talented had never sought promotion. They didn't know that Staff Sergeant Harper was actually Major Zoe Blackwood, callsign Reaper, the fighter pilot with 17 confirmed air-to-air kills who had officially died in a classified mission over Iran 5 years earlier. The transition from legend to nobody had been deliberate. After the Iran operation went sideways and half her squadron was compromised, military intelligence had given her a choice: disappear forever or watch more people die. She chose invisibility, trading her wings for wrenches, her cockpit for a maintenance bay. But she had never stopped being a pilot. She had simply stopped being acknowledged as one. The F-16 she had been rebuilding wasn't random salvage. 2 years earlier, she had specifically requested the wreckage of tail number 847, a fighter that had been written off after a training accident. While everyone saw scrap metal, Zoe saw potential. Working nights and weekends, she had slowly rebuilt the aircraft using parts from a dozen different sources. The engine was from a decommissioned trainer, the avionics from an upgrade program, the weapon systems from aircraft being retrofitted. On paper, the plane didn't exist. In reality, it was probably the most advanced F-16 on the base. Nobody questioned her pet project. Mechanics were allowed personal projects, and rebuilding a hopeless aircraft seemed like harmless obsession. Squadron leader Captain Brooks had even joked that Harper was building the world's most expensive paperweight. If they had looked closer at her modifications, the enhanced targeting systems, the upgraded jamming equipment, the reinforced airframe, they might have wondered why a maintenance worker needed such specifications. The attack came without warning. Intelligence later determined that the enemy had been planning the strike for months, waiting for the perfect moment when the base's defenses were at their weakest. The stealth aircraft had approached during a scheduled maintenance window when most of the radar systems were offline for updates. By the time the first explosion lit up the desert night, it was already too late. Zoe had been in Hangar 7 when the missiles hit. The impact threw her against a tool cabinet, and she felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with being under fire. Through the hangar's reinforced windows, she could see the runway burning and the control tower collapsed into twisted metal. Secondary explosions erupted across the flight line as fuel tanks ignited and ammunition stores detonated. Colonel Davidson's voice crackled over the emergency intercom system, calling all personnel to battle stations. But as Zoe ran outside to assess the damage, the futility of their situation became clear. Every F-16 in the active squadron was either completely destroyed or too damaged to fly. The enemy had known exactly what to target. This wasn't a random attack. It was surgical destruction designed to eliminate the base's ability to mount any air defense. In the chaos that followed, most personnel focused on damage control and casualty evacuation. But Zoe was running calculations in her head. The enemy jets would return for a second wave to finish what they had started. Standard tactical doctrine called for a follow-up strike within 30 to 45 minutes to prevent any survivors from regrouping. They had maybe 20 minutes before the sky filled with hostile aircraft again. She sprinted toward Hangar 7, her boots splashing through puddles mixed with aviation fuel and fire-suppressant foam. The hangar had been far enough from the main target areas to avoid direct hits, though the blast waves had shattered most of the windows. As she reached the massive sliding doors, her heart hammered against her ribs. If her rebuilt F-16 had been damaged, they were all dead. The hangar doors groaned as she forced them open manually, the electric systems having failed when the power grid was hit. Inside, emergency lighting cast eerie shadows across the workshop, and there, exactly where she had left it, stood tail number 847. The aircraft was covered in dust and debris from the explosions, but she could see no obvious damage. The landing gear was intact, the canopy uncracked, the engine intake clear. Colonel Davidson found her there 10 minutes later, frantically performing a pre-flight inspection by flashlight. The base commander looked like he had aged 5 years in the past hour. His uniform was torn, his face streaked with soot, and his normally steady voice carried an edge of desperation when he spoke. The colonel wanted to know if the aircraft was flyable. Zoe told him she had never tested it, but every system checked out on paper. When he asked if anyone on base could pilot it, she volunteered without hesitation. Davidson stared at her like she had suggested they fight the enemy with slingshots. A maintenance worker couldn't fly a fighter jet. It wasn't just impossible, it was insane. But radar was already picking up the return formation. 7 enemy aircraft approaching from the northeast, moving fast and low. In 15 minutes, they would be overhead, and this time, they would make sure nothing at Nellis ever flew again. The base had no operational fighters, no surface-to-air missiles, and no way to call for backup before the communications array had been destroyed in the first wave. Zoe climbed into the cockpit while Davidson stood watching in stunned silence. The interior smelled like new leather and electronics, all the modifications she had spent months installing and calibrating. She strapped herself in with the smooth efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Her hands moved across the controls with muscle memory that 5 years of hiding hadn't diminished. The engine ignition sequence went perfectly. The twin turbofans spooled up with a satisfying roar that could be heard across the entire base. Every system came online exactly as she had designed it. The heads-up display showed green across the board, the weapon systems armed without error. The rebuilt F-16 was not just flyable, it was combat-ready. She taxied out of the hangar as ground crews scattered to clear her path. Through the canopy, she could see dozens of personnel watching from bunkers and damaged buildings. To them, she was still just Harper the mechanic, attempting something that defied logic and training regulations. None of them could understand how a woman who fixed engines had become their last hope for survival. The takeoff was flawless. Despite using a runway damaged by missile impacts, the F-16 lifted off smoothly and climbed into the pre-dawn darkness. As the landing gear retracted, Zoe felt something she hadn't experienced in 5 years: the pure joy of flight. For a moment, the weight of her hidden identity lifted away, replaced by the familiar sensation of being exactly where she belonged. The radio crackled with confused chatter from the surviving communications personnel. They wanted to know her call sign, her authorization, her flight plan. Instead, she simply identified herself as Ghost 6 and requested vectors to the incoming hostile formation. Her voice carried an authority that made the controllers stop asking questions and start providing the tactical information she needed. The enemy formation appeared on her radar at 30 miles out, flying in tight formation at low altitude. 7 aircraft total, likely the same number that had conducted the initial strike, returning to verify the destruction of the base. They weren't expecting resistance. Intelligence had probably told them that Nellis Air Force Base had been neutralized. They were wrong. At 20 miles, Zoe began her approach. The enemy aircraft were maintaining their formation, apparently confident that they owned the airspace. She used this overconfidence against them, positioning herself in their radar shadow and climbing to gain altitude advantage. The predator in her, dormant for 5 years, fully awakened as she prepared for engagement. The first enemy pilot probably never knew what hit him. Zoe's opening missile struck his aircraft from above and behind, the explosion lighting up the desert sky like a miniature sun. The formation immediately scattered as the remaining 6 jets realized they were under attack. Radio chatter erupted across multiple frequencies as enemy commanders tried to understand how a base they had just destroyed was mounting an air defense. What followed was 7 minutes of aerial combat that would later be analyzed at every military academy in the country. Zoe fought with the skill and cunning that had made her a legend before her official death. She used every advantage the rebuilt F-16 gave her. Its enhanced maneuverability, its superior avionics, its weapon systems that were newer than anything the enemy expected to face. The second kill came as 2 enemy jets attempted to bracket her in a pincer movement. She pulled the F-16 into a vertical climb that should have been impossible for an aircraft of its age, then rolled inverted and dove between them. Her cannon fire caught the lead aircraft in the engine section, sending it spinning toward the desert floor in a trail of flame and smoke. By now, the enemy formation had realized they were facing a pilot of extraordinary skill. The remaining 5 aircraft began using advanced tactical maneuvers, trying to isolate her and overwhelm her with coordinated attacks. But Zoe had an advantage they couldn't match: intimate knowledge of the terrain. She had flown over this desert for years before her disappearance, knew every canyon and ridge that could provide cover. She led them into a chase through the mountain valleys east of the base, using the rocky terrain to break their radar locks and force them into single-file pursuit where their numbers meant nothing. The third kill came when she suddenly pulled up and over a ridgeline, then dropped back down to catch the pursuing aircraft from an impossible angle. Her missile struck its target center mass, turning the enemy fighter into a brief fireball that briefly illuminated the canyon walls. The remaining 4 pilots began to understand what they were facing. Radio intercepts later revealed their growing panic as they realized their carefully planned operation was being dismantled by a single adversary. Their formation discipline began to break down as individual pilots started making desperate attempts to gain advantage or simply survive the encounter. The 4th and 5th kills came almost simultaneously as 2 enemy aircraft attempted a head-on attack, counting on superior numbers to overwhelm her. Instead, Zoe timed her missile launches perfectly, sending 2 heat seekers at the precise moment when the enemy pilots were committed to their attack run and couldn't maneuver to evade. Both aircraft disappeared in twin explosions that briefly turned night into day. With only 2 enemy aircraft remaining, the tide had completely turned. The hunters had become the hunted, and both pilots knew it. They attempted to disengage and flee back across the border, but Zoe wasn't about to let them escape to report what they had seen. She pursued them across 50 miles of desert, using every ounce of performance her rebuilt aircraft could provide. The 6th kill required everything she had learned about air combat in over a decade of flying. The enemy pilot was skilled and desperate, pulling his aircraft through maneuvers that pushed both planes to their structural limits. The dogfight lasted nearly 4 minutes and covered 20 miles of airspace before Zoe finally achieved a perfect firing solution. Her cannon burst struck the enemy aircraft in the cockpit area, ending the fight instantly. The last enemy pilot chose surrender over certain death, ejecting from his aircraft rather than continuing a battle he couldn't win. Zoe watched the parachute deploy in the distance, then banked toward home as the sun began to rise over the mountains. 7 enemy aircraft had approached Nellis Air Force Base that morning. None would return to report the results of their mission. The landing was as perfect as the takeoff had been. As the F-16 rolled to a stop on the damaged runway, Zoe could see dozens of personnel emerging from shelters and damaged buildings. They lined the taxiway in complete silence, watching as the woman they had known as a mechanic shut down the most advanced fighter on the base after single-handedly destroying an entire enemy formation. Colonel Davidson was waiting as she climbed out of the cockpit. The base commander looked at her with an expression that mixed awe, confusion, and dawning recognition. Behind him, other officers were checking classified databases, trying to understand how a staff sergeant in the maintenance section had just performed aerial combat maneuvers that defied explanation. The truth emerged slowly over the following hours. Computer records showed that Major Zoe Blackwood, callsign Reaper, had been listed as killed in action during a classified operation in Iran 5 years earlier. But the pilot who had just saved Nellis Air Force Base was very much alive, standing before them in grease-stained coveralls with 17 confirmed kills on her record and 7 more added in a single engagement. The cover story had been perfect for 5 years. Staff Sergeant Harper had been an ideal identity, competent enough to avoid attention, invisible enough to hide in plain sight. But perfection had its own dangers. The rebuilt F-16 wasn't just a maintenance project. It was a weapon system prepared by someone who understood that wars never really end. They just pause between battles. Colonel Davidson offered her immediate reinstatement to active duty with full rank recognition. The Air Force needed pilots with her skills, especially now that the enemy had revealed their capability for coordinated strikes against major installations. But Zoe looked at the aircraft she had rebuilt from scrap metal and spare parts, then at the men and women who had watched her transformation from mechanic to legend. She had spent 5 years learning that identity was more than rank and recognition. The woman who had fixed engines in anonymity was the same person who had dominated the skies above the desert. Both versions were real. Both had value. Perhaps the greatest victory wasn't in the air combat, but in proving that heroes could exist anywhere, even hidden in plain sight among the people who kept the machines running. The nameplate on her workbench had read, Harper Aircraft Maintenance, for 5 years. By afternoon, it would read, Major Blackwood, Fighter Squadron. But the tools would remain exactly where she had left them, waiting for the next impossible project that would need building. From pieces everyone else had written off as hopeless. In every workplace, every neighborhood, every community, there are people whose true capabilities remain hidden beneath the surface. The quiet colleague who never speaks up in meetings might be the one who could solve the crisis everyone else finds impossible. The person doing the job others overlook might possess skills that could change everything. We see them every day, the mechanic, the librarian, the nurse, the teacher. And we make assumptions about their limits based on their job titles rather than their potential. But history is written by those who refuse to be defined by others' expectations, who prepare in silence for moments that may never come, and who stand ready to reveal their true selves when the world needs them most. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one you can see coming across the horizon. Sometimes it's the assumption that ordinary people can't accomplish extraordinary things. And sometimes the mechanic who fixes your airplane knows exactly how to make it fly when everything else has fallen from the sky. If this story moved you, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, please subscribe to the Human Stories channel and help us share more tales of courage, hidden heroes, and the power of never giving up on who you really are.